So hello everybody, and welcome along to the second class in this Mind and Its Potential. So this is an 8-week course, and it was the introductory program put out by the FPMT, which this centre is a member of. And this course, Mind and Its Potential, is the first in the course because understanding the mind is fundamental to knowing and understanding the teachings of the Buddha. And of course, it's essential in terms of us discovering the sources of happiness and the sources of suffering, and to adopt one and to abandon the other. So let's begin by, like we normally do, so just sort of relax in your seat. Allow your shoulders to drop and relax. And while you continue to breathe normally and naturally, become aware of the movements that take place in your lower belly each time you inhale or exhale. If you do not notice the movements in the belly, then notice the feelings that take place there each time you inhale and exhale. So while you are continuing to breathe normally and naturally, imagine that all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, all the Dharmapalas and the Dakinis, and all the deities and the protectors are in the room with you. And also imagine that all sentient beings, including your parents, your other family members, other people who are close to you, people who harm you or appear fearful to you, and strangers are also present. And I think that by listening to this teaching today and engaging in it, your intention is to bring about freedom for yourself and for every other living being. And you're going to do this by first abandoning attachment to the fantasies of just this life, and then to all the pleasures of cyclic existence. To your own singular welfare and to grasping at intrinsic existence to be real. And I think that by doing so, you can help yourself and everybody else turn their mind to the truth and to practice this truth as a path. And through that practice, remove confusion on the path. And bring about insight into your own pristine awareness. Now, to produce the spiritual process of skillful means, indivisible from wisdom, decide to help everyone who's engaged in the path as explained by your teacher and that lineage. And since only the three jewels and the teacher, indivisible, protect that effect within us, try to encourage every living being to seek this refuge from the depths of their own heart. So now we'll take refuge together and generate the mind of enlightenment. So if you have the prayer book in front of you, or you've downloaded the prayers, or you have memorized them, whichever of these three, let's engage in saying them together now. So the Buddha's in front of us, surrounding us, all sentient beings on the level of the ground. Think, I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Now, to stabilize this wish and to enhance it, to increase it, we'll recite the four immeasurable thoughts together. So may all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. And may all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and aversion or hatred for enemies. Now, to actually accomplish the path to enlightenment and enlightenment itself, we need to abandon different forms of thought and behavior and adopt other forms of thought and behavior. And these are all summed up in the prayer called the Seven Limbs. So we'll recite this together. Once again, thinking that all the Buddhas, Bodhisattvas are present and we're surrounded by all sentient creatures. Reverently, I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind. I present clouds of every type of offering, actual and imagined. I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginning this time and rejoice in the merit of all holy and ordinary beings. Please remain until the end of cyclic existence and turn the wheel of Dharma for living beings. I dedicate my own merits and those of all others to the great enlightenment. Now finally we come to the offering to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in front of us so that we can accomplish the goals that we seek. And there are different ways of doing this. So one way you could do is you think of your offering, that the mandala is actually a representation of your body, speech, and mind. Others are to think that the universe, the external universe itself, and yourself can be the offering. But the essence of it is just to let go at grasping at either of these types of phenomena as being truly existent. So this ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field. May all living creatures enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandala Kamnaryatayami. So you think you release the offering, it's accepted by the field of merit in front of you. The Buddhas and Bodhisattvas smile at you in delight. And your mind really appreciates that smile and transforms into an openness or an open plane, so that understanding is very simple and easy for you. Okay, everybody, thank you very much for joining me in the preliminary prayers. So I guess we'll begin the class in a minute or so. So, Miffy, I'll do the share screen now.
Yeah, that's right. So just push the little green button down the bottom where it says share screen.
Yep.
And
here we are.
Yep.
Is that right?
Yep, that's good. Great.
Okay, class 2 of this 8-week course. What we've covered, we've looked at the person and precious human rebirth. We looked at both of these topics last week. So in brief, the person is the I imputed to any of the 4 or 5 aggregates. And in terms of precious human rebirth, we need to recollect, possibly even daily, that the body we have at present is qualified by these 8 freedoms and 10 fortunes. And although it is a home of illness and the basis for the sufferings of old age, in a way it's like a bubble in that it lacks a core. And that day and night we can make good use of this body of ours by using it as a means to serve other living beings. Now the realization that we want to walk away from this topic, or the realization we want to take with us from this topic, precious human rebirth, is the development of self-confidence and appreciation of our potential. And that potential, of course, is, if it was fully realized, is Buddhahood, partially realized liberation, and the other type of result we'd like to have is to actually, once again, take rebirth as a human being with leisure and the leisure and opportunity to engage in practice again. And this is what we looked at last week. So today's topics, we're going to look at the mind, basically. And we're going to sort of look at how our science in the Western world presently looks at consciousness. We're going to see that the Buddhists present consciousness as being not physical. We're also going to define the mind. Now here's a quote I found online by Lama Thupten Yeshe, one of the founders of our organization. And he says, "Without understanding how your inner nature evolves, how can you possibly discover eternal happiness? Where is eternal happiness? It's not in the sky or in the jungle. You won't find it in the air or under the ground. Everlasting happiness is within you, within your psyche, your consciousness, your mind. That's why it's important that you investigate the nature of your own mind." Now, at present, we don't have a science of consciousness. In fact, the sciences of the West have only assumptions about the mind. Also, our scientists have no instruments to measure the presence or absence of mind. And at present, there are more than 200 definitions of mind with no agreed upon consensus. So this is our situation we find in the West. Like I said, in this course, we'll have a little look about the Western presentation and also the Buddhist presentation. And to help us, I've relied on these books here. So, Sleeping, Dreaming and Dying is a product of the 4th Mind and Life Conference that took place over 5 days in October of 1992 in Dharamsala. So that's like 18 years ago. But it does have excellent presentations of the person and the mind. So the next one, Buddhist Thought and Applied Psychological Research, Transcending the Boundaries, is written by leading scholars and includes an excellent foreword by the Dalai Lama, and it explores the interface between Buddhist studies and the uses of Buddhist principles and practices in psychotherapy and consciousness studies. So it's well written, it's not hard to read, but it gives you, a good insight into some of the different studies of consciousness and so forth. Now, the next two books, Contemplating Science and Meditations of a Buddhist Skeptic, are both written by B. Alan Wallace. So Wallace spent like 14 years as a Buddhist monk, was ordained by His Holiness, and then later earned his undergraduate degree in physics and the philosophy of science at Amherst College. And he also has a doctorate in religious studies from Stanford University. Now, both of these books sort of raise profound questions about human nature, free will, and experience. And Wallace really challenges the claim that consciousness is nothing more than an emergent property of the brain with little relation to universal events. So this might be a little bit more difficult to get your head around. Nevertheless, it's very informing reading, because you get pretty quickly the position of most of the scientists and neuroscientists of how they look at the mind. And Wallace really questions that, and you see lots and lots of faults in the presentation of the West. The book on the bottom here, Science and Philosophy in the Indian Buddhist Classics, is fantastic. It's not easy reading, but you can read it and understand it. It might take a few goes at it, but it really helps. It shows us the classical Buddhist explorations of the nature of the material world and also the human mind, and puts them into a context for us, modern readers. So I've used this book quite a lot in terms of the quotes and the investigations into things like different types of mind, impermanence, and just the nature of the universe itself. So it's very useful. The next one, The Tradition of Mahamudra, has got excellent explanations of consciousness itself, different types of mind, and who the person is. Two views of mind, as you can see there, Abhidharma and brain science. Also very interesting, but not easy to get your head around. And finally, The Mind and Life, once again, a very interesting book to read. It is readable. You can understand it easily. But what's really interesting is this idea that what is the nature of reality? So that also, there's different points of view from the West and from Buddhism. And I've used all of these books and others in pulling notes from and ideas from to present to you as a class. They're all well worth reading. I think if you were to begin one of them, start with Sleeping, Dreaming and Dying, and then perhaps go to The Mind and Life, and then have a look at the other ones. So let's look at, first of all, of what exists. So the Buddhists are very big, especially Tibetan Buddhists, are very big on classifications and categories. And here they're sort of saying in this diagram is that whatever does exist, it is without self. So what's that mean? To be without self, to be selfless. And Chandrakirti says, what we call self refers to any nature or state that objects could have in which they rely on nothing else. So I'll say this again. What we call self refers to any nature or state that objects could have in which they rely on nothing else. Now, the non-existence of this is what is called selfless. So whatever does exist does not have a nature or a state in which they rely on nothing else. So that's common to everything. So that's the basis of everything, the selfless. And from the selfless, we can see things that do exist and things that do not exist. Now, one of the objects that does not exist is self, in terms of this presentation. Self in terms of inherent self. Self in terms of intrinsic self, that sort of thing. That's a non-existent. Whereas self that is dependent upon a body and mind does exist. So whereabouts does it exist in terms of permanence and thing? Well, that self is not a permanent object, so it belongs to the category of things. So things are conditioned phenomena, meaning they depend upon causes and conditions, whereas the permanent objects are not produced. Therefore, they do not depend upon causes and conditions. Now, the conditioned phenomena consist of these three main types. Material phenomena, which are called forms or form, then consciousnness, which is a non-physical phenomena, and then we have another category here called the abstract, which is holiness is called it that. But some of you might be more familiar with the term non-associated formative factors. So that's a big word. I think abstract is much briefer and it can actually fit in the box. So I used abstract.
Hang on a sec, Eddie. Just can you hold on a moment because you've just frozen.
Okay, I can't hear you either.
So we just got to non-associative formative factors.
Okay. So non-associated formative factors and abstract names for the same type of phenomena. These abstract phenomena are phenomena that are neither form or consciousness. They don't belong to either category properly. So one of the phenomena was there's a lot of phenomena in this non-associated formative factors or the abstract phenomena. Probably the most important one for us is the person or I. So I is or the person is imputed to form and consciousness. It's not form and it's not consciousness. It does exist. It's a thing. It is selfless, and it belongs to this category called the abstract. Other phenomena within this category are things like time, east and west, years, months. Now, they're not consciousness, they're not form. Now, there's a lot of phenomena in this category called the abstract or the non-associated formative factors.
Also, Eddie, there's a question about, can you give an example then of what a permanent thing is? So I'm thinking, what's the difference, say, between these abstract things and something that's permanent?
Well, the abstract phenomena are all impermanent. Right? They all change.
And so then something that is permanent, what's an
Okay.
example?
So let's have a look. Let's go to the next stage. I'm glad I did this because I thought someone's going to ask this and we rarely cover it. So,
well, it's Mark. Mark asked it. So yep, thank you, Mark.
Have a look. So the next slide, Venerable Vasubandhu, he says, the three unconditioned phenomena, in other words, the three permanent phenomena are space and the two cessations. Space does not obstruct, and analytical cessation is freedom. So like I said, unconditioned means permanent, not dependent upon causes and conditions. Here they're pulling out two of them, space and the two cessations. So here it's saying space does not obstruct. So that is the type of permanent space. There is another type of space which we are much more familiar with, which is impermanent. So that is produced space. So we've got two types of space: unproduced, which is permanent. They're saying it does not obstruct, and the other is produced space, which actually changes. And then we look at these other two types of permanent phenomena called analytical cessations, and they're describing them as being states of freedom. So they're the two examples, but I'll better say a little bit about each of them. So the word space is defined differently according to the different Buddhist tenet systems. The Vaibhashikas, the lowest tenet system, describes spaces that which is free of obstruction and accommodates physical phenomena. That's how they describe it. The next tenet system describes space as in terms of a non-implicative negation, which is the mere absence of obstructive contact. Right, so that's what, and that is a permanent phenomenon. Now, analytical cessations are of different types. There's two main that they mainly speak of. So an analytical cessation refers to the cessation of the afflictions which are relevant to one's stage on the path owing to analytical wisdom. So if you apply the wisdom of emptiness, the wisdom realizing the emptiness of the phenomena to an affliction, if you do that enough, the affliction will never ever arise again. So that non-arisal is a permanent state. Non-analytical cessations refer to factors that prevent the arising of future phenomena because of the power of the incomplete conditions. An example of that would be, say for instance, that the fact that we are living as human beings with leisure and opportunity to engage in the path, and we are not, therefore we cannot experience the sufferings of the hell realms. So that is not dependent upon analysis. Right? So it's called a non-analytical cessation. But if this life were to come to an end, then it's possible we would experience these sufferings. Geshe once used the example of, does anyone here not have the flu at the moment? And a number of people put up their hand. He said, so that at the moment is this a non-analytical cessation. You're not experiencing the suffering of the flu. Why? So because the conditions for the flu don't exist at this moment. So that's a cessation. And that's a permanent state while that is in place. But then of course it changes. So to know more about the subject, the best book to rely on here is that book called The Physical World by His Holiness and Thupten Jinpa, that book on the bottom that I pointed out. Are there any, this is probably doing your head in a little bit, but do you have any questions?
So no questions, but the flu example is a really good one.
Yeah, that's a sort of a simple one, isn't it? Another, in terms of the analytical cessation, like for instance, you could put an end to hatred. So when that hatred is finished, that is permanent. But that ending or total elimination of hatred is attributable to the power of cultivating the path. And that's basically our job, isn't it? To put an end to these afflictions. And the way to do that, of course, is to use the wisdom realizing emptiness. So that puts, when you do that, that cessation, the ending of it is permanent. Another example of a permanent phenomenon would be nirvana. Okay, so that I think we should do for this. I mean, like I said, if you want to know more of this, the book, The Physical World by His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Thupten Jinpa. And also there's a book on emptiness, a really big fat one. Can you remember the author of that, Miffy?
Was it Hopkins?
Yeah, Hopkins' book on emptiness also has material on permanent phenomena and these two types of cessations.
Everyone's saying, okie dokie, we might just have to let that one sink in.
Yeah, you probably do. This takes a lot to get your head around, and not to expect you can just listen to me talk and look at a slide and get it. But now, so what we're going to look at now, so we're going to have a look at things. And things depend upon causes and conditions, which means that they're subject to change, that they are impermanent. So, change. And we have different types of change. And here we're going to have a look at what we call coarse change or impermanence and subtle impermanence, subtle change. So in general, this word impermanence is based on whether something undergoes change. And conditioned phenomena are subject to change owing to the causes and conditions that produce them. So if something has causes and conditions, it is subject to change.
Eddie, can I just clarify something? So Anthea says it's a perspective shift. Once we realise something, we can never unrealise it?
Yep, that's right. It's true, Anthea.
Great, thanks.
So all conditioned phenomena continuously undergo change without remaining static for even a single moment, which this is leading to the course of subtle impermanence. For example, we can look at the leaves of these trees in this picture. So in autumn, they change color. Come winter, they've fallen to the ground. So that process of change takes place over time. It doesn't take place spontaneously. Right? It takes place over days and weeks until in the end they fall to the ground. So when they're on the ground, that's like coarse impermanence. And even, I guess, in a way, you could say that if you notice that one day they were green and bright, and then a couple of weeks later they were this color here, that would also be coarse impermanence. Continue to transform. Now, but these changes are taking place every moment. It's just that the eye does not see, our physical eye does not see those changes taking place every moment. So, and if this subtle change did not take place, the coarse change, or the gross or obvious change, would also not take place. Now, in general, I say there are two types of impermanence. Impermanence in terms of a continuum, and this relates to coarse impermanence, and momentary impermanence, which relates to subtle impermanence. So coarse relating to continuum, momentary relating to subtle impermanence. So again, an example or an illustration, if you take me, Eddie, for instance, Eddie not remaining after death is extremely coarse impermanence. It's very coarse because you can ascertain this just by looking at the person called Eddie. All you see is a corpse. You'll say Eddie's dead, Eddie's not there. So you don't need any reasoning, you can just look and see it, ascertain through your senses. But the fact that I was changing moment by moment by moment by moment until I finally died as was a corpse, that's not ascertainable to us, right? We have to sort of infer that. So this is a bit more subtle. So Eddie not remaining from the time of his first moment to the second moment is subtle, subtler. But even more subtle than that is that even in the first moment, there's disintegration. And so the first moments are like just names that we give to a phenomenon that's already changed in the in the very what we call the second moment. It's changed. So three types of impermanence in subtlety. Coarse, obvious to the senses. We can infer that, okay, then there must be a change taking place here from one moment to another. But even more subtle than that is that the moment itself disintegrates. Now, I suppose that in terms of its disintegration, you would call it, that's momentary too. So to understand this and then to realize this, as Anthea had said, is an incredible accomplishment. In fact, the Buddha said of the two greatest accomplishments a person could realize, it is the realization of impermanence, and the other is the realization of emptiness. And in fact, if you get your head around the very subtle impermanence, it's a direct pointer to the emptiness of all phenomena. So once again, in relationship to this topic of change, Venerable Dharmakirti said, take a product. It is characterized by disintegration from the first moment of its existence. Why? Because it arose from its own causes with the essential nature of disintegration, without relying on some alternate cause of disintegration. So this is a syllogism. So this is like if somebody asks you, why do things change? You could say this, and this would describe the process of change and why it takes place. Now this process of change, we could also call it transformation. And the transformation also has two types. You can transform into the very same entity, or you can transform into distinct entities. So transformation into the same entity is the disintegration of the conditioned entity within the same continuum. And so if you took like yourself or myself, there is a process of disintegration going on, isn't there? Where we are produced through causes and conditions, so change is going on. And there's a continuum of myself speaking in this moment and the self that spoke in a moment 3 minutes ago. So there's the body of Eddie and the speech of Eddie, the mind of Eddie 3 minutes ago, and there's that now and in a few moments' time too. But all the time, all that's going on is there's a continuum of Eddie, and that continuum is disintegrating. Now, this transformation or this disintegration does not exist separately from its enduring state. I mean, the enduring state is Eddie, enduring over time, and at the very same time, there's this, like I said, disintegration. So these two sort of merge as one and are designated a single characteristic, impermanence, or that which is momentary. I'm sorry, I can't hear you, Miffy.
So disintegration depends on cause and condition?
Yeah, and the causes and, yeah, that's right. So, and the causes and conditions, yeah, because, yeah, we could say that's true. Whatever is caused and dependent upon conditions disintegrates dependent upon those causes and conditions.
So that was from Jan Mustenbrock. Then Sue asks, so is an enduring state a substantial cause?
Is an enduring state a substantial cause? Yeah, you could say that, Sue, because that state produces the next moment, especially in terms of the mind, and even physical phenomena too. Yep, so you could say that. You could call it that. The enduring state is the substantial cause for the next moment.
Okie dokie.
Okay, so that's that. So that's just the way things are, right? So I mean, this is not a, I mean, this is the Buddhist presentation, but it is actually the way things are. So if science were to look at this, they'd have to agree with it. It's just the nature of things. It's in particular the nature of conditioned phenomena that depend upon causal and conditions. So there's no disagreement between modern science and the Buddhists on what I've just presented. But now we're going to come and have a look at consciousness itself, and here we're going to find lots of disagreement. But first, no science of consciousness. So at present, modern science has no means of detecting the presence or absence of consciousness. So a little bit of background, right? So it wasn't until the late 19th century that science attempted a formal study of the mind. Given the enormous influence of scientific materialism, it's not surprising that a physical approach, the study of behavior and the brain, the grey matter, held sway. By the early 20th century, non-material qualities attributed to the mind, in other words, thoughts and feelings, images, dreams and so on, were neatly avoided by correlating them to the physical brain, with its internal physiology and its into physical behavior. Thus, mind is simply redefined as the brain. But like I put up here, at present, modern science has no means of detecting the presence or absence of consciousness. It has no compelling method for identifying the origins of consciousness, its function, or its outcome. Now, descriptions in the cognitive sciences of how the mind emerges from the physical brain are incompatible with any other kind of emergent property observed and described in the physical sciences, such as chemistry and biology. In fact, the emergence of the mind from the brain is not observed at all. So although correlates between brain functioning and behavior have been discovered, no one has explained what it is about neural systems that could enable them to generate or even influence first-person experience. Now, all of this information was taken from B. Alan Wallace from a book called Embracing Mind. And in fact, one of the pieces of homework I'd like you to have a look at is a talk that Alan Wallace gives on the Buddhist science of mind at the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives in Dharamsala. So I'll come back to that again at the very end of the course and give you a bit more information about that.
So Eddie, there is a question from Jan Marston-Brock. If science has the nature of mind, it would be impossible to observe itself.
Sorry, if science has
the nature of mind, it would be impossible to observe itself. So it's kind of like asking, can from a scientific point of view, is it possible for the observer and the object to be the same thing?
If this is if they're putting it to the, if you're sort of saying that the mind is the brain, is that what you're saying? So it's impossible, if the mind and the brain are the same thing, it would be impossible to observe that?
Yeah. Also, then from a Buddhist point of view, then everything is mind.
Well, we'll come to that. We'll come to that. So I'll say a bit more about this, and then maybe that'll help clarify things, or you might have different questions. So the next slide is why the brain is not the mind. Now, I'll just say this again. Right? So the brain itself does lend itself to quantitative measurement, doesn't it? I mean, you can just look at that and go, well, how large is the brain? How much does it weigh? But if you were to say, how large is the mind? How much does the mind weigh? That doesn't lend itself to quantitative measurement. And so just like in the first study, there's no instruments. There are no instruments made yet to observe either the presence or absence of mind. Because remember, modern science, or science, is based on measuring the physical. So all important advances in science have been made through new instruments. Yet brain science has no technological means of detecting consciousness or any kind of subjective mental experience. Nor does it have any means of demonstrating how the brain produces consciousness. By assuming that mind equals brain, that all subjective states boil down to physical functioning, brain science has placed itself in a difficult position. If mental phenomena are emergent or secondary properties of brain tissue, I said their relation to the brain is fundamentally different from every other emergent property and function observed in nature. In fact, in the theory of brain correlates to mental states, such observation is actually missing. No mental states are observed when he was examining brain tissue, and conversely, the brain is not observed as part of the experience of a mental state. The idea that mental processes and their correlated brain functions to be equivalent is a hypothesis that is simply not validated. Yet it is one that scientific materialists find appealing and therefore often accept without question.
Eddie, can I also just confirm that, like in this context, mind and consciousness are the same thing?
Yeah, in this consciousness, they're equivalent. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
So mental phenomena do not have a location in space and do not lend themselves to quantitative measurement. There are two very different types of phenomena. If a physical phenomena were to act as a substantial cause for a mental phenomena, there would seem to be a lack of accord between the two. Meaning, the question is, how could one transform into the other when they seem qualitatively so very different?
So then how come, Eddie, in Western science, it's just kind of skimmed over so often, this correlation between brain and consciousness, like it's a done deal? How come that so easily happens?
I don't know, but I guess it's happened many, many times in the past. Science has done this before with many different things, assumed something exists and just went ahead, and then later on discovered many years later, actually, it doesn't. You know, so hypotheses are made, and then you sort of act from that and see what happens. You know, you'd probably be more familiar with it yourself if you're reading so much about science. I can't hear you.
Sorry, in the beginning of neuroscience books, often the first part goes along really well, talking about neurology, and then suddenly the writer conflates the two, brain and mind, in the one sentence without even noticing, and that's what I can't understand, how that can happen.
Well, it's been going on for a long time, and I remember Wallace saying that when you're at school doing this, and you know, suddenly became aware of, hang on a moment, he said, yeah, there's no actual study of consciousness. What you study is the brain. You study the physical matter. But then they do this sort of leap over and say they're the same thing.
Yeah, so it seems that Western science studies the evidence of consciousness, or the so that there is a correlation in the brain. It's evidence that there's consciousness, but it's not the same thing as consciousness.
No, that's right.
And there have been a few studies I've read in the New Yorker where people studying neuroscience and the science of consciousness have come to that conclusion that the brain shows very subtle evidence of consciousness, but you can't say it's the same thing as our experience.
Yeah, that's right. So there are correlates, but correlates doesn't mean they're the same thing.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's the type of science. The what do you call that type of science?
Scientific materialism.
Scientific materialism, because to them it's like, no, everything that exists is material. That's what we're dealing with. Everything, and other than that, ideas of mind and soul, they just put them to the side. If we can't observe it, it doesn't exist. So you can see this. This is where we're at present, but like there are changes being made and different ways of looking at it now, dependent upon these conversations with this holiness and the different sciences that have been going on for 20 odd years. Okay, so let's like I said, so a lot of this material, which is really interesting and will really shake you up, is to be found in the books by Alan Wallace. They're really good to read because it gives you the whole history of science and the assumptions that have been made, and the differences between different types of science. So, but we need to now move on. So let's have a look at the mind itself, how it's defined. So like I said before, if you go to the dictionaries and look at the different presentations of it, Wallace says there are over 200 definitions of mind from the Western perspective, and no agreement on any one of them. But the Buddhists have a definition of mind, and it's called clear and knowing. So clear describes the nature or entity of the object called consciousness, and knowing describes the function. So I really like that. I think that is quite beautiful, really. Clear and knowing, nature and function, or entity and function. There is an alternative definition, which is the subjective event that arises in dependence on the object that appears to it. That is the subjective event that arises in dependence on the object that appears to it. And so there are different synonyms for mind. So we can call them awareness, knower, consciousness, cognizer. There's a couple of others too. But try to remember here that when we use synonyms like this, it's in a very general sort of way of talking about it. Because once you start getting into it in a bit more depth, the different schools and the different traditions have different meanings for these words. Like for instance, in the Kagyu and the Nyingma tradition, when we use the word mind, they're just talking about the conceptual mind. Right? This is the most coarse entity. But if you use the word awareness, which is also a synonym for mind, they're not talking about that. They're talking about very, very subtle mind. The term rigpa is often used. So just something to be aware of. If you switch around from reading of different traditions and how they present the mind, words that you take to be synonyms may not be. They won't have the same meaning. So just be aware of that. Now, clarity and knowing, or clarity or clear and cognizance, are a single entity, meaning they're like water and its wetness, or like fire and its heat. So if you have fire, you have heat. If you have water, you have wetness, and you can't pull the wetness out of the water. They're a single entity. And consciousness or mind is the actual process of knowing the object that appears to it. So when we use the word mind or consciousness, I think that we're using it often we use, what's that term, as a noun. right? We're naming a thing. But mind itself is actually a verb. It's a doing. It's a process. It's a dynamic agent. So it's not a static thing. Mind is basically the name given to the process of clarity and knowing. So I'll just stop there for a moment and ask you, is that reasonably clear to you?
That is amazingly clear and also mind-blowing, but it's got a very nice feel to it, thinking of it as a process, not a permanent thing.
Yeah, this is right. And this is, I think by thinking that just the way it appears to us, hearing the sound mind, it naturally appears to us as a noun, as a thing. We even talk of the place of the mind. Things like this. So yeah, and it doesn't exist like that at all. So it really throws us off in a way. Now this word clear has a number of different meanings too. So, or different sort of, what can I say, meanings. What can I say? Well, I'll just describe the word clarity then. So first of all, on the easiest way of understanding the word clear, it just means non-physical. It's a non-obstructive entity. So that's the first thing. So the conventional nature of here is just non-physical. So word clear meaning non-physical. What it also means, at a more subtle level than this, is the reflective capacity. And so if when you put, one of the best things to use for something is the idea or the simile or analogy of the mirror. Right? The surface of the mirror itself doesn't hold anything, yet it's possible to reflect anything. Right? The surface is actually empty of all types of phenomena until it's aimed at something, and then suddenly, boom, there is the thing. And so mind is like that. Remember also the mind is a produced phenomenon. It depends upon cause and condition, so it's also changing. So although it's not physical, it changes from moment to moment. And the word clear also can refer to the mind's ultimate nature, its most subtle level of existence, meaning its non-intrinsic nature, its empty nature, but you have to remember it's empty and dependent. So this is the most subtle nature of all, empty and dependent. One level up, this ability to reflect. The next level up, that it is impermanent and non-physical.
And Eddie, so then the clarity of the mind, it's to do with this kind of the function and the nature. It can still be by nature clear but afflicted.
Yep, that's right. Yeah. So actually we could do, I haven't put this in, but I think you can discover all of this for yourself without relying just on me saying this or reading a book. Like if you, gosh, what can I say? Like to discover the impermanence of the mind. So what you can do is just, well, I'll ask you to do this now, right? So just think of a round yellow ball. Imagine a round yellow ball. Okay, so you should be able to all do that. That demonstrates right there the clarity, right? It's appearing to you. Right? Now I want you to think of green grass. A large expanse of green grass. Imagine lying in that grass and looking at the grass. It's green. Right? Is that appearing to you? if it is, this once again describes the nature, the clarity. Right? The fact that you know that that is green grass and not a yellow sun is a knowing, the function of your mind. You know this is a green grass, this is an image of green grass I'm looking at. Before, I was looking at an image of a yellow ball. The fact that when you look at the green grass, the yellow ball is not there, shows you the impermanent nature of your mind. The mind changed. Right? At one stage something was there, then it wasn't. That's change. There is no actual green ball there, though, is there? There's no yellow ball there, there's no actual green grass there. That's not physical. And the fact that you had that the yellow ball and the green grass appearing were dependent upon me saying to you, imagine this and imagine that. Right? So you see here the dependent nature of the mind, dependent here upon language, the object that you created to remember, and then its appearance. So here we've got the demonstration of the clarity and the knowing of the mind. So before I go on and talk a little bit about knowing, is that okay for everyone? Does everybody understand that or get that? Or do you have questions?
Yes, there is a little bit of a question about just what we mean by permanence, because there is a tendency to feel, oh, so maybe the clarity of the mind is a permanent thing, and maybe the process, the function of it is impermanent.
Okay, so here there are different ways of using the word permanent. Right? So here we're just using it in terms of the way of if something were permanent, it does not depend upon causes and conditions. That's one of the ways of using permanent. The other way of using permanent is that you're really talking about a quality. The thing changes all the time, but its nature remains the same. Like, for instance, the nature of, the clarity is a function of is part of mind. So it's always there. So you might argue, well, that's a permanent feature of mind. And on one level you could say, yes, it is. But if you were to say, oh, therefore it never changes, you go, no, it does change. It changes from moment to moment to moment because the mind changes from moment to moment to moment. And clarity is one of the characteristics of that mind. So here, once again, it's just being sure both ways of using permanent are okay and correct. But it's just, don't cross them over.
Yep, good, thank you.
Okay,
there was also the analogy like of the mirror, and so the mirror can have the dirt on it.
That's right. So the clarity can be obscured. And that's so for us, self-grasping obscures the clarity. We talk about the mind being defiled, and you ask, being defiled by what? And you say the affliction. So once it's defiled, once the clarity is defiled, of course, then the knowing is defiled, right? You can't know the object properly. The clarity has been obscured. But those obscurations are not of the nature of the mind itself. But they come and go, in other words. They're also like, impermanent. So we have this knowing clarity called mind that is changing from moment to moment to moment, yet it always remains clear and it always has the function of knowing. And both of these can be obscured due to adventitious phenomena, but which also come and go, which are also impermanent. So knowing describes the function of the mind, what we call cognizing or apprehension, apprehending, knowing. And this is really the engaging with the contents of the experience. So the engaging with the clarity. And this is taking place at the same time. So there have been, so this is not always the case, but it's most often the case. There have been experiments showing to you that something can appear, but it's not known immediately that it has appeared. So, for instance, when an object comes through the eye, through your visual consciousness, so the clarity, it appears, but sometimes it's a tiny moment before it's actually known. But other types of consciousnesses that don't depend upon the senses, they're known as they appear.
Which
So
strikes me, Eddie, as being the exact opposite of how we normally think of seeing as believing, whereas actually seeing is one remove.
Yes, it is. That's right. The seeing comes, and then there's the, what did I see? And that's on one level, a slow level. So the mind gives rise to something and it apprehends it. There is the arising of a sight and the seeing of it. There is the arising of a thought and the thinking of it. So in brief, meanings of the word clear, right? So non-physical, non-obstructing, reflective and empty. So non-physical meaning without form, color, shape, mass, gender or material dimension. So non-physical, without form, without color, without shape, without mass, without gender or material obstruction, without or material dimension, sorry. Now in terms of what I mean by non-obstructive, it means of a non-material nature. So in other words, coming back again to non-physical. At its subtle level, we talk about the reflective capacity that allows the aspect of an object to appear, like a mirror or like this lake here. At its most subtle level, we talk about its non-intrinsic nature, how it is dependent and empty. Now, sometimes they use the word luminous to describe the mind, like luminous and cognizant. Other times it's clear and knowing. So I want to have a look now at the word luminous and how knowledge of that word can inform us in terms of understanding the mind a little bit better. So the way they use this as a simile, right? So if you get a clear crystal and you put it onto any type of surface, the surface comes up through the clarity of the crystal. So the crystal will appear to be the color of the surface. And the real clarity of the crystal is not seen. What you see is the color. It's like when you go to the movies and they project the color onto the white screen. The white screen disappears. Can't be seen, but it's colored. But you turn off the projector, now the white screen is seen. And that was always there. So it's the same with this idea of the crystal. You place on a colored surface, the clarity of it won't be seen. But if it's removed from the colored surface, then the clarity can be seen. So what we're getting at here, what this is pointing to is that we can actually discover the clear nature of our own mind. But we can know its clarity. And we can engage with that clarity. So I remember a story of the, so Mahamudra practices, the object there is not the I or the person, and you have to discover that the I or person lacks inherent existence, but it's the mind. So we have a mind, and we're examining to see if it has the inherent existence it seems to have. And we discover that it does not have that inherent existence. So it's empty of inherent existence. Mind is empty. But we have to, the mind is a conventionally existing phenomena, just like a person is. So before we can discover the emptiness of that phenomena, we actually have to know what the phenomena. But so here, the way to do that is to discover the clarity. Right? And then we can ask questions about how that clarity is appearing to the knowing. Do you have any questions about the clarity and the luminous? Anybody?
There's no questions about
Okay.
that, but I'm just wondering from an experiential point of view, how would you be able to spot it as a feeling or an experience?
No, it's actual experience. So His Holiness talks about this in his book, in his different books. He's mentioned a number of times. So one day he was, trying to discover the nature of the mind, of course, to find the object that is clear, trying to find the subject that is clear. So what he used to do was he'd look at a statue of the Buddha in front of him. So this was a gold statue, but at one part of the gold, around the heart level, it was it seemed to be less gold. It was less bright, and he focused there. And so what you're sort of doing is you have to sort of what can I say? Look at what's looking. And what will happen is that you actually, we're going to say, see what is seeing the slightly tarnished object, which is your mind. So so to do this, of course, you've got to really slow your mind down. So they often say, no thoughts of yesterday, no thoughts of tomorrow. So rest the mind. They say rest, rest, rest. And there's a lot of emphasis put on being relaxed. And to stop the mind jumping around to the present stop the mind jumping around to the past or the future. So you've got to sort of do that, slow everything down. And if you can do that, you'll, it's like I said, using the analogy of, if you wish to see the color of the screen while a movie is on, you won't be able to do that. You have to turn the projector off. Then the screen will appear. Then the white of the screen will appear. So it's the same in the mind. You have to stop your projections. Then the natural clarity, like the surface of, like the mirror, will be seen, or the surface of the lake can be seen. They can be seen to be just clear. So that's an actual experience.
That's a fantastic example.
Okay, so let's move on then. We'll look again at just a little bit more at the word knowing and the word cognizance. So knowing is just the engaging with the contents of an experience, the engagement with it. And knowing, like I said, describes the function of the mind, the arising of something and engaging with it in a cognitive way, in a knowing way. So once again, I said, the idea here is like practices, do it yourself. Like, if I was just to sit here now and have my eyes closed and all I'm seeing is black, but if I was to just suddenly think of, say, Miffy, right? So then the appearance of Miffy arises, and I know that's the person I'm thinking of, right? So there's the arising and the knowing of it. And you go, that's the function of mind. And just move it around to different objects. Like, sometimes if you're looking straight ahead, you can't see what's behind you. So your mind is just engaged with what's in front of you. But if you turn around and look at the other things, you know those other things. And the other objects, once in front of you, drop out. So you can see two things there, knowing and a change. We also talk sometimes, don't we, when we talk about, I know I'm sad. I know I feel unwell. So you are engaging with, the contents of an experience. So that engagement is the knowing. The engagement with the content is the knowing. If you close your eyes, there is a knowing that all the colors that you saw before are not there. You open your eyes, there's knowing that now you see all these different colors and shapes.
Eddie, so Martin has kind of a sideline question, but to do with this, so then where would memories be held?
Well, Martin, if you find that place, let me know. So when you say where are they held, are you talking in terms of the physical or the mental?
Well, he hasn't said yet, but I mean, in terms of this description of knowing, then where are they held in the mind? Yes, Martin's saying, where are they held in the mind, mentally?
Well, there are different positions put on that. Right, so the mind only say that they're actually held in a type of mind called the alaya vijnana. In fact, Martin, if you could get to this level of clarity, what would happen pretty quickly is that you could get access to a great many memories from there. So this is what Wallace is often talking about, and in terms of developing karma binding, that if you could get to the clarity and then rest in that, memories of past lives would appear to you. So if you're saying, like, where are they? They're beneath the clarity. They're beneath that clarity. And when they come up, then they are, shown to us. So we can say, well, I've had this memory of this and that. We engage with those appearances.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so let's have a look at cognizance, which is just another word for knowing. So it's the activity of cognitive engagement in the 5 sense objects or in objects appearing to thought. So it's very similar to what was said before, the engaging with the contents of an experience, but he would say it's the activity of cognitive engagement in the 5 sense objects or in objects appearing to thought. So it's the activity of apprehension, or it's a cognitive engagement in the 5 sense objects or in objects appearing to thought. Now these cognitive events possess the nature of knowing because of the fundamental nature of clarity that underlies all cognitive events. Now, as I said before, so the clarity and the knowing are a single entity. Once it appears, we have the clarity at the same time, that's known. So he said you can discover this for yourself just by looking ahead and seeing what's directly in front of you and knowing that that is there. And while you're doing that, what's behind you is not clear and is not known. But as soon as you turn around and look behind you, now that is clear and is known. And what was previously clear and known is now vanished. You can also do this with thinking. You think anything, right? It will appear to you and you will know what you're thinking. Drop that thought and think of something else. And then that will appear and you'll know that. And when you do that, the other thing is dropped. So cognitive events possess the nature of knowing because of the fundamental nature of clarity that underlies all cognitive events. Now, there are explicitly cognitive states, meaning obvious cognitive states, like belief, memory, recognition, and attention on the one hand, and specifically affective states, like the emotions on the other. In addition, there seems to be a category of mental states that function primarily as causal factors in that they motivate us into action. These include volition, will, desire, fear, and anger. Even within the cognitive states, we can draw distinctions between sensory perceptions, such as visual perception, seeing, which has a certain immediacy in relation to the objects being perceived, and in conceptual thought processes, such as imagination or the subsequent recollection of a chosen object. Now, these latter processes do not require the immediate presence of the perceived object, nor do they depend upon the active role of the senses. So this is really coming back to your question, Martin, about memory. Don't require the immediate presence of a perceived object, that do not depend upon the active role of the senses. And this, what I just said, is a really general picture of the mind from the Tibetan Buddhist point of view.
Eddie, which book are you reading from?
These are from B. Alan Wallace, from Embracing Mind. That's on page 172. So this type of way is much wider and deeper than the present, like the Western way of thinking about the mind, like I said, or consciousness. West has a great store of knowledge about the brain and the function of the brain, but not the mind or consciousness. Now we come to another word called merely. So I use this word a bit now, which means this: there is no independent self-reliant me or self-reliant mind within the head or body having or controlling the experience. This is a doowacky, isn't it?
Yeah, because it feels like there is.
That's right. It does feel like there is. Yes, this is where feelings are misleading. So it feels like there is, and often without investigation, we believe there is. But when we actually investigate, we don't find an independent self or independent mind or a thing called self or mind within the head or body controlling experiences. So mere also has other meanings. So it also excludes the need for any significant strength of comprehension of the object. So you know, so sometimes if you look at a photo and you've got about 50 people in it, and you look along for yourself in the photo, you find yourself, but all those other pictures of people are also appearing to you, and they're being comprehended, but not with any great depth or strength, are they? Because if you are asked, what was the person in the top row, third along, what did they look like? You'd probably go, I don't know. You know, was it a girl or was it a boy? You know, you go, I don't know. So mere is just excluding the strength. It doesn't, you know, mere is it can appear, but not necessarily be comprehended with any strength or depth. But it's also excluding this, the idea of an independent self or mind within the head or heart. It's an agent having or controlling the experience. So this sort of is revealing the deepest nature of consciousness, its lack of intrinsic nature. And the word merely is really referring to the ultimate nature of consciousness, its lack of intrinsic nature, but also its existence in mere name. So we do have a mind, you know, and the mind is the name given to this continuum of clarity and knowing. You know, and then when we look at the words clarity and knowing, you're going to go, well, the clarity is also a word given to something else. And knowing is the name given to is, you know, the function of the mind. So it's all mere.
So is it the strength of the mental factor or of attention?
Our attention is a mental factor. So you can say it's either. So it has to do with the, that strength has to do with the mental factors that are also play their part in the functioning of the mind. You know, like if you took away the mental factors of the mind, there would not be a mind. There's no mind to be spoken of. So mind is also dependent upon those mental factors. It's the name given to the 5 mental factors, or, you know, actually a whole lot of mental factors, but just 5 sorted out.
So what I find amazing is how merely points to the ultimate nature of the mind, which is slightly counterintuitive at first, thinking about it.
Yeah, that's right. I like how it points to both. Yeah. But if you go to the empty nature, then you come back to the dependent nature. If you go to the, you know, like merely dependent means it lacks inherent existence. So that's why I really like that word, you know, mere or name, just in name. So let's summarize now. So we looked at these 3 topics, the limits of present science. Like I said, we have no instruments to measure the absence or presence of mind. Mind is not physical because it doesn't have the characteristics of any other object that is physical. And then we came to define the mind as being clear and knowing, or cognizing and clarity, or cognizance and luminous.
So there is another question.
Mm-hmm.
Does mere point to the passive nature of the mind, or is the mind passive?
No. No, no, it's like I said, it's a verb, it's a doing. It's knowing, doing and knowing. So I suppose I asked, what do you mean by the word passive?
Well, it's Jan who's asking it, so I'll just wait till he types, but I suppose receptive.
Oh yes, it is receptive, yes.
And so mere actually points to the nature of the mind.
Yeah, the deepest nature, and it's to the 2 natures. It points to the ultimate nature and the conventional nature. And like I said, the difficult thing is getting your mind around that. You've got to sort of bring them together. Yeah.
So Anthea says bringing them together as in emptiness. So
like empty appearance, empty and appearing. Like, you know, for a thing to be empty, it has to conventionally exist. So the conventionalities are empty, but there isn't any empty without it depends upon something else.
Brilliant.
Okay. So just as a summary, I'll read to you once again from the book Embracing Mind by B. Alan Wallace. He says, neuroscientists commonly assume that the mind, if it exists at all, is a feature of the brain. The grey matter either is the mind or it alone makes the mind. However, there are major unresolved problems with this view. Indeed, it is only a belief, and one backed by very, very little hard evidence, if any at all. Cognitive science has failed to clarify human subjectivity in relation to its central feature, consciousness, and to convincingly equate mental phenomena with brain activity. If consciousness is not produced solely by complex circuitry, electrochemical processes, revved up to some threshold where consciousness just happens, well, where might it come from? Many contemplative traditions, Buddhism especially, would say that science has been looking in the wrong direction. We should be asking an entirely different question. Where do all phenomena, not just consciousness, come from? Now, the short answer to that is all phenomena are appearances to the mind. But the mind spoken of here includes not only the contents we normally attribute to this word, but a great deal more. For Buddhism, the mind is all-embracing. It has no existence apart from appearances, and appearances have no existence apart from the mind. Even our concepts of space-time and mass energy have no existence apart from the mind that conceives of them. Thus, there are no absolute objects or absolute subjects. Nor is there any conflict between mind and matter. Nor does one hold a dominant position over the other. We may separate them at the conventional level for the sake of discussion, but no absolute dualism separates mind and matter. Like our face and its image in a mirror, they arise in mutual dependence. So this is all from the book Embracing Mind on page 180. So that's dynamite. It's a real something to deeply think about and try and refute it. Right?
So Eddie, that's the Buddhist presentation of mind?
Yeah.
Yeah, that you just read.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you take the other presentations, it's really problematic. That's what I'm saying. Science science can't refute that. Actually, some of the more deeper types of science. What's that deep science called, Miffy, please?
Like quantum physics.
Yeah, from the quantum physics and quantum mechanics, they will all agree with that. That's fine. You know, it's just most scientists, especially neuroscientists, aren't even going near there. You know, so anyone involved in neuroscience at present doesn't have the background of that type of deep physics. If they did have, they'd have to change their whole way of thinking about the relationship of the brain and mind. Now, I just about finished, everyone. So this is the supplementary reading that you can do for next week. So it's page 74 and 78, unit 2 of all the big handouts that Miffy gave you, and pages 91 to 95 of the unit 5 called Buddhist Psychology. So have a look at that to sort of complement what you're listening to today. And finally, if you could just write this down, there's a talk given by Professor Alan Wallace on the Buddhist science of mind. And it's day 1 and day 2. They're given at the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives, so that's LTWA, in 2017. And the second talk on day 2 is called Mind, Emptiness and Quantum Physics. So, you know, have a look at that and listen to that. That's really interesting. And it won't do your head in. The consequences might, but you will understand what he's saying. So finally, last questions, anybody?
So I've just put all of that into the chat there, Eddie.
Okay.
And Jan was kind of mentioning, you know, this is from a Western science point of view. It's like uncertainty principle or the probability theory. This the quantum mechanics side of things.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And Wallace will talk about that material, you know, to actually what do you call it, sort of fortify the Buddhist point of view, because it doesn't go against it. That's the interesting thing. So it's been lovely being able to talk to you like this, everybody. I mean, I find this fascinating and useful, so useful. And I hope you will too. If you don't, that's basically my fault for not explaining it so well. But like I said, we have lots of good books. There's great stuff on YouTube. Have a look at it and have a think about it. And then try and relate it, please, back to your own experience. So I want to dedicate now for...
Hang on a second, Eddie. So just stop the screen share for when you're going to dedicate. Just go down the bottom there and yep, that's it. Fantastic.
Okay. So let's dedicate, everyone. We've all put time into listen to this talk. We're putting time into think about it. We're making efforts to use it realistically in our life. So that's these are types of actions we're engaged in. So those actions have merit because we are doing it to become enlightened for the sake of others. So the merit that we've generated and the merit that all the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas and other sentient beings who, like us, exist like dreams and in mere name. Through the efforts that we've made, may we attain enlightenment, which is like a dream, a reflection, and a mirage existing in mere name. May we be able to lead every dream-like sentient being who exists in mere name to that enlightenment which exists in mere name, by ourselves alone, which, not existing from the side of the body and mind, exists in mere name. So, there we go, everyone. Thank you very much.